First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having us. I think I can speak for all three of us that this is really an honor, and a big thank you, of course, is owed to Cora for organizing this virtual event. Thank you so much, Cora. So I'm going to just start my thing here. Second. Okay. So today I'm going to discuss some of the ongoing silences in French post-war discourse surrounding the Holocaust. I'm going to explore these issues through the subject of my MA thesis, who is Captain Marceline Vieux, the little-known commander of the Drancy internment camp in Paris. But first, I want to take a quick look at where the national conversation currently stands. So on July 16th, 2020, French President Emmanuel Macron tweeted the following message to his more than 6 million followers on Twitter. On July 16th and 17th, 1942, more than 13,000 Jews were arrested by French people and by the French state because they were Jews. More than 8,000 were detained at Veldiv before being deported to Auschwitz. Never forget. Now, some of the responses to Macron's tweet were revealing. Several commenters questioned the goal of Macron's tweet. What is it with this self-flagellation? Why are you denigrating France? Some demanded to know. Others countered with statements like, France was occupied, the Germans organized the deportations, not the French, and the real France was the French resistance. The general reaction seemed to be, it was the Germans, not us. But Macron was right. On the morning of July 16th, 1942, 9,000 policemen, all of them French, were mobilized by the French state in the hunt for Paris's Jews. Over the next 2 days, they arrested some 13,000 of them, at least 4,000 children. These people, criminalized overnight for being Jewish, were corralled into Paris's Vélodrome d'Hiver, an indoor sports arena, and left there for 5 days without food, water, or sanitation. The vast majority were then sent to Drancy, France's largest internment camp. Now, over the course of the war, the French gendarmes of Drancy packed 64,000 Jewish women, men, and children into cattle cars and sent them to the killing centers of Sobibor and Auschwitz. Fewer than 2,000 of them survived. In light of this, why the resistance to Macron's self-referential commemoration? Let's change this. The case of and against Captain Marceline Vieux sheds some light on this question. Marceline Vieux, a captain in the French gendarmerie, served as commander of the Drancy camp from July to November 1942. He was responsible, directly and indirectly, for some of the most egregious violence against the Jewish prisoners of Drancy. Reports of this violence are abundant and detailed in the archive of the case against him. Vieux was never without his whip, witnesses wrote, which he used indiscriminately on women, men, and children. According to Drancy's ex-prisoners, he tended to be provoked by perceived shows of disrespect from the prisoners or by the presence of German officials during deportations. For example, when a boy of around 6 approached Vieux and asked for permission to fetch something before his transport to Auschwitz, the captain exploded. After whipping and cursing at the child, he turned to a nearby German soldier and said, laughing, "You have to train them." When at his trial, Vieux was accused of abusing the deportees in front of the Germans, visibly to please them, he offered up the standard French excuse. These violent scenes had been preemptive strikes for fear of German intervention. But among Drancy's Jewish prisoners, those most vulnerable to Vieux's and others' predations were Jewish women born outside France. Their Jewishness, their foreignness, and their gender combined to make them easy prey in the eyes of French and German men. As foreign-born Jews, they were by definition, quote-unquote, deportable, which meant that they could be assaulted and disposed of without scrutiny or consequences. Vieux and a number of his French colleagues at Drancy were keenly aware of the women's vulnerability and the opportunity it presented. And the archival evidence reveals that they took full advantage. In Captain Vieux's post-war trial, one ex-prisoner of Drancy, Louis Lévy, declared that 2 foreign women, physically attractive, were installed in a separate room and treated comfortably. It was assumed that they were at the disposal of Captain Vieux, who in fact treated them with solicitude. One day, an incident occurred surrounding these 2 women, and without any notice, they were deported immediately. We guess that this was the work of Captain Vigneault, who wanted to get rid of compromising witnesses. Vigneault's own colleagues, who, unsurprisingly, did nothing to stop his abuses during the war, corroborated this testimony during his trial. And their depositions added an extra dimension to the captain's cruelty. They alleged that Vigneault had impregnated the women before adding their names to the deportation list and sending them to Auschwitz. Now, less than a year after France's liberation, Maurice Schumann, the host of BBC's Radio Londres and one of de Gaulle's right-hand men in the resistance, wrote a letter to the French Minister of Justice, which I've reproduced right on this slide. He demanded that Vigneault and his colleagues be prosecuted. Similarly, and in the letter below, friends and relatives of Vigneault's victims petitioned the courts demanding the same. And yet, in March 1945, the case against the captain was closed, and no reason for the case closure was given. By the time the case was reopened, the direct result of collective action on the part of Drancy's Jewish ex-prisoners, Vigneault was on the run. He fled first to Spain and then on to Argentina, where he spent the next 11 years. He would return to France in 1956, only to elude justice for a second time. For his extortion, his brutality, his sexual violence, and his cruelty, Captain Vigneault was never punished. Now, understanding why Vigneault and others like him were never punished for their anti-Semitic violence and their direct role in the Holocaust provides insight into the still distorted memory of the Holocaust in France. In its post-war purge of collaborators, the French government intentionally excluded crimes to do with anti-Semitic violence. The Gaullist or post-war French definition of collaboration was limited to participation in a collaborationist party, the creation or dissemination of pro-German propaganda, zealousness towards the Germans and participation in the black market. So you'll notice what's missing. This definition was designed to exclude anti-Semitic collaboration. In fact, the trials against Vigneault and his colleagues were the only ones of the purge trials that called on Jewish witnesses to even provide testimony about racial persecution. And even so, Vigneault's violence towards Drancy's Jews was immaterial from a legal standpoint. Because he was charged with treason, that did not include anti-Semitic brutality, and he could not be found guilty. Now, the French government was willing to acknowledge and punish only a portion of the country's wartime collaborators. This decision was equal parts pragmatism and calculated deceit. Defining collaboration is difficult in the aftermath of any occupation. Now, it's particularly so in the case of France, given that for much of the war, a number of allied countries, including notably Canada and the United States, recognized the collaborationist Vichy government as the official sovereign French state. So therefore, could have French persons obeying French orders and enforcing or accepting French policy qualifies collaboration. Collaboration with whom? This was the French state. And by this metric, only a minuscule number would escape the stigma of collaboration. And given that anti-Semitism was a central part of Vichy's wartime policy and was devised and enforced by the French themselves until 1943, the inclusion of anti-Semitic persecution in the definition of collaboration risked ensnaring a great number of French people, many of whom occupied high up, hard to replace positions, judges, for example. It's unsurprising then that many of those French judges who had themselves served under Vichy and meted out its anti-Semitic policies shied away from prosecuting others for anti-Jewish persecution. And again, collaboration proved hard for the government to define. To illustrate this point, let's consider the following heartbreaking scene described by Drancy prisoner Georges Cohn in a diary entry dated August 28, 1942. He writes, "Alongside the 500 orphans, they packed the elderly, the helpless, and all of the sick whose fevers were less than 39 degrees into the waiting cattle cars. When the call rang out in the morning, we watched as a little man, 2.5 years old, wandered out without luggage, without a blanket, without food, from the mass of confused shadows. He walked alone with a confident step toward the group awaiting the train. The most hardened observer could not help but fall silent." Now, according to Serge Klarsfeld's estimates, 929 of the 1,000 people deported to Auschwitz from Drancy on that day were sent directly to the gas chambers. Of the remaining 71 selected for slave labor, 8 survived the war. That's 8 survivors out of 1,000 people. and this was one of 46 convoys, all carrying approximately the same number of people, whose departures were overseen and managed by French officials. The French government refused to accept or acknowledge the reality of French participation in an atrocity of this scale. So when in the fall of 1944, a member of the resistance involved in Vieux's case wrote that for Vieux, the duty to disobey should have been sacred, he was forgetting perhaps that the same could likely have been said of millions of other non-Jewish French women and men. The vast majority of French people did at best nothing to prevent Vichy's assault on France's Jews. The ubiquity of French involvement in anti-Jewish persecution emerged in the months following liberation, making the issue of collaboration harder for the government to contend with. More questions arose. How much zeal did a French perpetrator have to display in order to be considered a collaborator? What if they didn't know they were being sent to their deaths? What about those French people who took over Jewish-owned businesses and homes? What about those who accepted promotions when the Jews were purged from the French civil service? These whataboutisms were endless and almost universally compromising. In the end, it seems, these questions just proved too complicated and unpleasant for the government to answer. Accepting responsibility for France's role in the Holocaust and forcing the French people to reckon with that responsibility threatened both morale and France's position on the global stage. The French response was to deflect. And Hannah Arendt, as you can see this quote, memorably describes this form of national self-deception. She writes that such an escape from reality is also, of course, an escape from responsibility. All the peoples of Western Europe have developed the habit of blaming their misfortunes on some force out of their reach. No country, including France, wanted to consider itself even partially culpable. Narrowing the legal definition of collaboration to exclude aiding, abetting, or profiting from the Nazi program of mass murder thus had a twofold benefit for the post-war French government. First, it resulted in the overall impression that fewer French people had collaborated than, in fact, actually had. And second, it obscured the specter of the Holocaust from France's wartime narrative. So in the years following France's liberation, the French government's primary concern was its reputation. It sought to project an image of France as honorable, principled, tolerant, the antithesis of Nazi Germany and Vichy France. But the discomforting reality of French perpetrated racial persecution stood in direct contradiction to this contrived self-image. And the simplest way for the Gaullist government to bypass these threats to its national self-image was simply to refuse to acknowledge them. It silenced the Jewish victims of French violence and avoided recognizing or punishing French perpetrators. And these layers of silence linger. Captain Vieux, for one, has largely eluded the historian's gaze. Neither he, his crimes, nor his victims appear in the rearview mirror of historical inquiry. Now, if we hope to better understand the full extent of France's role in the Holocaust, it is crucial that we look at the granular level, at individual perpetrators, individual victims, individual rescuers. Their stories challenge long-standing assumptions and complicate generalizations. The real France was neither a nation of resistors, nor was it a nation of collaborators. There was, in fact, no real France. It was a country where, partly through the efforts of French, Jewish, and non-Jewish aid workers, rescuers, and resistors, 75% of the Jewish population survived the genocidal assault. But it was also a country where that genocidal assault, which led to the murder of 80,000 Jewish women, men, and children, was carried out by French people. Both are true, and neither should be ignored if we hope to progress towards a deeper and more honest understanding of France's wartime history. Thank you. Now I'll turn it over to Cora or Sara-Jane, either way.
Sara-Jane, why don't you go ahead?
Perfect. Thank you, Jessica, for this amazing presentation. And thank you, Cora, for organizing this event. I'm just going to wait and see for the PowerPoint. Jessica, you're muted. Okay, good. All right. So this presentation delves on child survivor Elizabeth Gilles' dream memory of her mother, Irene Nemirovsky, and her path in recollecting and working through her loss with the publication of Le Mirador, Mémoire rêvée, and Un paysage de cendres. It offers a small window into my current research, and inside of 2020, this short presentation emphasized the use of post-memory literature as a way to delve into and enact the working through of a traumatic past, especially when the trauma was lived in an age where memory faded away and the past became dust. We will see tonight that by her peculiar position, Elizabeth enables readers and scholars to acknowledge different methods of narrative to commemorate traumatic events and loss. Next slide, please. Firstly, for those of you who might not know Irène Nemirovsky, she was one of the most prolific and widely read female authors of the 20th century. Published in France by several editors, Nemirovsky works at a second wave of appreciation following the Rentrée littéraire of 2004 with the publication and adaptation of her posthumous book, Suite Française. Nemirovsky's book, written between 1940 and July 42, contains 2 novels out of her planned sequence of 5 and retrace the fictional accounts of the Nazi occupation while portraying life in France between June 40 and July 41. The other 3 novellas were supposed to take place later during and at the end of the war. However, on July 1942, Nemirovsky was arrested as a stateless person of Jewish descent, which impeded her to finish her book. What is interesting in Suite Française, besides its incredible account, is that it took 60 years before the daughters opened up their mother's notebook, containing the book hidden in a suitcase. The suitcase evokes then a potent literary metaphor of the known and unknown past of the daughters and their memory. But beside the incredible discovery that Suite Française appeared to be, an essential question came during my research: how to recover lost mother, lost childhood, and a past that have been torn apart. For Irène's daughters, Denise and Elizabeth, to break the silence and find the words to describe the loss were found through writing, as they both tried differently to recover the time spent, the one where, as children, they had a mother to love. Next slide. For Denise, who was 12 years old when she lost her parents, literature was considered with crucial importance. Considering herself as a transmission belt and not a writer, Denise acknowledged that literature brought a series of small healings, which, added together, eventually brought some relief. Denise processed her working through by effectuating substantial and methodologic work with Suite Française, visiting schools to discuss her past to younger generation, doing interviews, and by achieving archival works on her sister's book, Le Mirador. Her journey ended with the publication of Suite Française, to which she said afterward, "I'm at peace." On the other hand, Elizabeth, the younger daughter, used fiction to bridge her forgotten past and her late mother. Elizabeth, 5 years old, when her mother and father disappeared, could only unleash her talent as a writer and working through her past by writing her dream memory of Irène and her own a few years after. I knew it was a vital need for Elizabeth to go in search of a mother she did not remember, said Denise. Elizabeth experienced the Holocaust consequences at a very young age. As a result of this premature state, the continuity between the events lived and her memory are hampered. She is a survivor, a hidden child that has been affected by the Holocaust, and her young age implies specific experience and trauma that occur, or at least began, before the formation of stable identity that we associate with adulthood, and to some extent, before any conscious sense of self. Next slide. In her article, The 1.5 Generation, Thinking About Child Survivors in the Holocaust, Susan Solomons attributes to some survivors the term 1.5 generation on survivors that were, and I quote, "too young to have had an adult understanding of what was happening to them, but old enough to have been there during the Nazi persecution of Jews," end of quote. This notion, I believe, allows us to be more specific in the range of affect of Elizabeth, and the fact that due to her young age, she could not recall her experience nor her memory, which sunks more and more into a blurry oblivion. This understanding also allows us to delve into the use of fiction to depict affects and traumas, especially Marianne Hirsch's notion of post-memory literature, usually attributed to the second generation. Next slide. Post-memory, for scholars Marianne Hirsch, describe the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before. She states that they remember only by means of stories, image, and behaviors among which they grew up. Post-memory literature then demonstrates the difficulty of undertaking the perilous mission of the duty of memory, since its connection to the past is influenced by representation, often based on unspoken rather than on memories, on the invisible rather than the visible. This memory brings narrative transgression, demonstrating once again the anxieties and the crises that the authors might experience and their efforts to face the traumatic past. The metaphor of sewing, proposed by McLaughlin, demonstrate that these writings leave visible traces and that they leave gaps between the stitches. Moreover, psychoanalyst Judith Keistenberg mentioned that descendants of survivors and victims often find the need to discover, to reenact, or to live the parents' past. For survivor, Judith Lewis Ehrman emphasized the importance of survivors in reclaiming an earlier history and life from before the traumatic event as part of recovery. So despite the different theoretical frameworks, these two notions can effortlessly be linked to Elizabeth's Le Mirador, where she imagined and dreams of her mother's past from childhood to adulthood, having no concrete memories of her. Thus, we see both the child helplessness and trauma and the adult attempt to render that helplessness retrospectively in language and by using fiction. This is why I posit that notion of post-memory literature should also be acknowledged in Elizabeth's case. However, it should be noted that the power of post-memory literature can also be its weaknesses, for great difficulty can arise within the text, provoking denial of historical accuracy and tarnishing the reconstruction of trauma and violence. Nevertheless, and for the case of Elizabeth, the index of post-memory as opposed to memory is a performative index, shaped more by affects, needs, and desire at a time when temporal distance attenuates the links to authenticity. Post-memory, as Gilles' dreams memory aims to do, seeks connection and creates where it cannot recover. It imagines where it cannot recall and mourns the loss that cannot be repaired. Next slide. So, in Le Mirador, Elizabeth Gilles imagined her mother's every footfall, her childhood as the beloved daughter of one of the wealthiest Jewish banker in Russia, her grotesque relationship with her mother, the family's exile in Finland, their new life in Paris, her wedding to Denise and Gilles' father, and her last year with her children under the occupation. Privileged witness, yet partly amnesiac, Elizabeth long waited to write this recollection. For an extended period, silence accompanied Elizabeth as her position was intrinsic with the debate of telling as a means to express past trauma, or silencing as the anxiety regarding the failure of language to capture and represent the Shoah adequately. This oscillation between these two actions demonstrates the survivor's difficult choice, caught between words and silence, and between the danger of telling and those of being silent. As scholars Hayward mentioned, and I quote, "If silence at times appears as death, on many other occasions, words and speech appears as death, unable to convey feelings associated with an experience where words simply fails us." End of quote. Elizabeth, argue, finally override the plea to silence with the publication of her first book. In Le Mirador, Elizabeth had to attack various questions and assume a series of identity elements that she had partially avoided until then. Russia appeared to be the most problematic part in telling her mother's past because Elizabeth wanted a documented, realistic biography. The problem was that from 1903 to 1930, she had no documents on her. Yet, imagining this previous world was necessary for Elizabeth. The fictional imagination of Jill was significantly fueled by this desire to know a world that her mother lived prior to the Holocaust, a process to reclaim an earlier history and life from before the traumatic event. Reclaiming a world that Elizabeth had not experienced, she draws an allegory of origins to reach the dream country, her mother's homeland. Varying between imagination and recollecting her mother's past, Elizabeth underwent a process crucial for her, one that Marianne Hirsch also underlined in her own process, and I quote Hirsch here, "The Chernobyl of my past memory is an imaginary city, but that makes it no less present, no less vivid, and perhaps because of the construct and deeply investigated of nature itself, of memory itself, no less accurate," end of quote. By linking together memory, fiction, and facts, Elizabeth allowed herself to gather and fix her own memory holes and found comfort in imagining her mother's unknown past. Le Mirador reveals Elizabeth's anxieties and affect, I suggest, by writing her mother's story using the first-person narration. By doing so, Elizabeth took action to reappropriate her mother's past and appropriate her own memories. And her struggle to understand her place in the world, and by writing her mother's story in the first-person narration, Elizabeth decided to assume the challenge and push boundaries by recovering her own voice. Indeed, chapters of Le Mirador are also punctuated by a little paragraph that records Gilles' own recollections. Hence, the first-person narrations embody the figure of the unknown woman, her mother, while she describes periods of her own life using the third-person narration. The two women's voices then overlap, giving each other the floor and representing this transgression, where the past not only interacts with the present, but interrupts it, sometimes presenting it as a function, even a direct representation in the present. The narrative strategy Gilles developed elicits in readers a greater openness to hearing the experience of the victim, of whom we will have perhaps otherwise forgotten, and hearing the survivor, even when some of their memory could not be perfectly recalled nor entirely remembered. Next slide, please. In 1996, after the publication of Le Mirador, Elizabeth wrote Un paysage de sang, so Shadow of a Childhood, a novelization of her own experience as a hidden Jewish child during the war. The passage from Le Mirador to Un paysage de sang enabled her to finally transfer her voice found in her previous novel and depict her own experience, again by using fiction. Un paysage de sang is striking for its ring of authenticity. The novel, beginning in 1942, as a member of the French resistance, brings Léa, a 5-year-old girl, to a convent in Bordeaux. Traumatized by the new environment and conformity that she has to comply, Bénédicte, 7 years old, provides a source of comfort for the newest member, who attaches herself like a shadow. The novel provides several glimpses and bridges the reality of Elizabeth to her protagonist, as Léa, following the liberation, waits at the Hotel Lutetia, the same one where Denise and Elizabeth long waited for their parents. Léa, as Elizabeth once felt, slowly becomes aware of her parents' fate and the fact that she waits in vain, for they have vanished. She is, perhaps once like Elizabeth, conflicted as she knows nothing about herself, nor about her origin or identity. Moreover, Léa's struggle with the memory of her parents creates what Elizabeth calls an invisible tragedy. The more memory she lost, the more she invented, wrote Elizabeth. As a result of her growing amnesia, Léa's identity is undermined as she has to accept the paradoxical fact that her parents are present mainly through their absence. She wrote, "I have no father anymore. I never had any parents." Elizabeth conveys, with Bénédicte's accidental and sudden death, and then with a powerful depiction. And I quote, "A rain of ashes which cover her completely in a shadowy gray blanket that finally dead all sound." End of quote. The end of A Paysage de Sang thus delivers a vivid portrayal of the consequences of the Holocaust for children survivors in the post-era. The end offers no sense of hope, as it highlights the unimaginable and unending despair of the protagonist. Perhaps there was no other way for Elizabeth to end her novel about the Holocaust. Gilles makes it clear that hidden children, or at least her, found no respite from her wounds, as a fractured identity could not be made complete. Perhaps the purpose of novels such as Le Mirador and Un Paysage de Sang was also to underline the need to remember both the dead and the survivors, and remind readers of the horror of the Holocaust, both in the past and in its continuity. In my sense, Elizabeth's books were, above all, the result of a working through process, allowing her to make peace with these remnants of memory. As scholar Dominique Lacapra argues that one may never entirely transcend an attachment to a lost other, one may generate countervailing forces so that the person can re-engage an interest in life. Elizabeth enabled this countervailing force, I argue, by retelling her fragmented and imaginative memories of her mother, and by fictionalizing her own experience of the Holocaust, its aftermath, and her loss. Next slides, please. Studying the epic of Irène, Denise, and Elizabeth brings the reader to a privileged proximity to their family, highlighting while carrying on the rich literary heritage of Irène. Perhaps one can also suggest that this process enabled both daughters to work through their affect, absence, and loss, each in their own way. Although not exhaustive, this presentation suggests the potent use of art and fiction as a working through mechanisms. Novels such as Le Mirador and Un Paysage de Sang allow a window into Elizabeth's anxieties, highlighting her affect and her particular position as a hidden child during the Holocaust. The performative index of Elizabeth's novels allow connections. It creates where it cannot recover and recall, which enables her, with her dream memories, a countervailing force that grants her the ability to mourn. And inside of 2020, recent academic works advocate for the diversification of testimonies to tarnish a possible erasure of those that did and do not comply within the narrow frameworks that often favor a perspective of management rather than confrontation of painful memories and traumatic experience. The richness of considering those writing, I will finally argue, elicits readers and scholars to build consciousness and a better receptiveness for adequately dealing with and representing a traumatic past, while recognizing art as a medium of therapy and working to emotion for survivors. As the film Unsere Kinder highlighted, what is the purpose of theater if not to provide a release for tragedy in a creative manner? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara-Jane. As Jessica is switching over the slideshow, we will move on to Fredrik. So whenever you are ready.
Thank you so much. So thank you as well to Cora for organizing this, and thank you so much to the whole Beth David community for having us. It's really a pleasure to be able to share our work. I think I can speak for all three of us. It's sadly a rare opportunity, but it's a lot of fun every time, or very kind of rewarding. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit from Sara-Jane's presentation, still talking about art, but I hope to kind of talk about collective art, specifically art in public spaces. So rather than talking about how one person helps many to work through a traumatic past, my work kind of focuses on the collective process and how we do that all together in our public spaces, something that I think is especially important during a time like the COVID-19 pandemic, where there's less person-to-person interaction, but we do kind of interact with the spaces around us. So as I say in my title, Holocaust Remembrance in Germany, Imperative or Opportunity, I actually have to say that the title should be and that I'm kind of poking a little bit of fun at my own project there. It's not an imperative or an opportunity, but I inherently see it as both. And most things that are an imperative or that are an ethical or moral imperative are often an opportunity to do good or to improve ourselves. And so I think that Holocaust remembrance, especially in Germany as the country of perpetration, is one of these things that is both imperative, but also a really fantastic positive opportunity in the present day. So Germany has many institutions that do remember its bleakest past. And while there's a lot of good that gets done in those places to learn and to continuously acknowledge the responsibility for this history, there's often also some areas where there is a room for improvement or where things don't get done quite as well as they could have been. So today I hope to talk about the city of Freiburg, which is in southwestern Germany, right in the three country triangle by Switzerland and France. And it's actually also the city that I was born in and raised in until I was about 10. So Freiburg, for those who don't know it, has long been considered one of the more liberal cities in Germany. It's very green, it's situated in a forest, and it has had a green mayor for whatever that's worth for the past couple of years. But as the city celebrated its 900th anniversary just last year, a study was brought into commission that would look at the legal ownership issues around one of its most central squares in the heart of the old city. As in many other cities, a lot of this downtown area is taken up with old ruins underground. And so as the digging process happened in order to excavate for new roads and for new sewage systems, things like that, they stumbled upon very large fragments of an old building. As this study kind of found, this space was actually the spot of an old synagogue that was destroyed in 1938 during the November pogrom on November 9th in an action that was kind of led across Germany. The SS and the SA locally riled up a bunch of local men who would set fire to the synagogue late that night, and the fire department was stopped from putting out the flames, and the rest of the building was actually demolished the next day. So in order to kind of see what the synagogue looked like originally, Jess, if I could ask you to switch to the next slide. So this is what the synagogue looked like around the end of the 1890s. So this is the original construction. So while the Jewish community in the area, there existed a Jewish community in the area of Freiburg from the 13th century onwards, it's really only in the 1870s that we see a true unfolding of Jewish community life in the area. And the reason that researchers kind of think this is that all of a sudden in the property books, the Jewish community owned this property right in the heart of the old town. And in 1870 was actually able to build the synagogue. There's reason to believe that for the next about 40 years, city administrators were relatively friendly with the local Jewish community. As the population flourished, the Jewish community was also actually able to raise funds to build a large expansion in the 1920s on the back side of the synagogue as we're looking at it right now. So this was evidently a period of really positive growth, and the local community seems to have, if not at least allowed Jews to live in the area, they actually did a lot of business with them. Unfortunately, this period of growth was ended in 1933 for events that I don't need to mention. In Freiburg, this was marked by the election of Martin Heidegger to the rector of the local university, an event that has been famously talked about in continental philosophy, but I think also more broadly in the German context, especially in Freiburg. In the early years after the war, an architect, Josef Schlippe, who had actually been an architect under the Nazis, was put in charge of the reconstruction, a trend that we see across Germany, unfortunately, as Jessica had mentioned, also something that happened in France very often. Schlippe brought forth practical issues of the rebuilding of the area of the old city, which had been nearly completely bombed except for the church right in the middle. He believed that a new synagogue would set an odd accent in the old town. And so for the next decade, nothing happened in that area. And though there was some attempts made by former Freiburg citizens from abroad, for example, Fanny Nathanson, who had moved to England, to actually redevelop the space, it wasn't really that anything was done with the former space of the Jewish synagogue until 1953, when the local committees found that a parking lot would probably be the best thing to put on this space. Evidently, the kind of practical perspectives that Schlippe had brought immediately after the war were still holding sway over most of the politicians and also the local community, which is very unfortunate. So my claim is that while it's not that we shouldn't be happy about the slow recollection that happened in Freiburg, as I'll show through the rest of my presentation, this kind of very slow process of recollection and this very slow process of remembrance of the destruction of the old synagogue and of Jewish life in Freiburg does hold some positives. And that while it's obviously unfortunate that a Jewish community was forced to compromise after such a horrific event, we can actually today look at this space that has been created in Freiburg with some positive view. Jess, if you could actually switch to the next slide, we can see kind of what the interim space looked like. So this is the square after the building of the parking lot in 1953. And if you can see, as you're looking onto that grass space, in the back right of the photo is where the synagogue would have stood. So, as I said, my aim in writing this paper was not to judge post-war city administrative workers or politicians, because that has been done in historical research quite a lot. But I kind of want to focus on this process of compromising that began in 1953, but hasn't really ended until today. So, the original kind of the beginning of the story that I seek to tell is actually in 2004, when the parking space that we see here still basically existed in its current form. This is a downtown part of Freiburg. There's the university that we're looking at, the opera house is on the right, and a brand new library was actually built right next to the opera house just a few years ago. And the street that we look at is connecting the old town to the train station. There's bus stations there, so there's a lot of people walking around here. This inner core is also marked by buildings that date back to the Middle Ages, and so it's really quite beautiful. So in 2004, the city officials decided that they had enough money finally to redevelop this space and to make it into something that the public would use for events, that restaurants could have their balconies there, that there could be protests, whatever. And so this was given into commission, and 2 architects from Freiburg won their design proposal. And Jess, if you could switch to the next slide. So in very nice aesthetic architectural fashion, this is what the design actually looked like. And so we're now actually switching our view by 180 degrees. And in front of us is the fountain that is built in the form of the old synagogue. And we're looking at the university library. So you might ask, beautiful, counter memorial, what else should we want? So unfortunately, when this project was proposed, what they had to do was to put water cisterns into the ground in order to create the fountain that would actually sit on top of this counter memorial, which is a design feature that's quite prominent in counter memorials across the world, especially in Germany, but also in New York City. This kind of like deep dive, if we think of the memorial at Ground Zero in New York City, it also has a deep hole in the middle. And so as they're digging into the ground to build these water cisterns, what happens is that the diggers knock onto rocks, and originally they think, okay, it's just the ruins of another old building here. But as I told you at the beginning, the study that was commissioned by the city found that this was actually the ruined foundations of the old synagogue that had been burnt down in 1938. And so in what I think is actually a quite liberal and progressive move, the city created dialogue process with the local Jewish communities. There's 3 of them. The Israelische Gemeinde Freiburg is the main one that kind of holds the most sway, with their leader Irina Katz. And so began a 17-round dialogue process in which they discussed what should we do on the one hand with the stones that we find, and on the other hand, what does this do to the actual development of this kind of water fountain that we, or this water memorial that we have conceived. And so throughout 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019, the city would meet with Jewish communities, the Jewish communities of Freiburg, over and over again, in what can basically be seen as a really great dialogue process. Unfortunately, as in 1950, and this is where the story takes not such a positive turn, the city officials in the end decided that they would remove all of the stones and did not inform the local communities before doing so. And so obviously this was met with an absolute uproar locally, not only from the side of the Jewish communities, but also from the side of many people like my grandparents who live in the area, and thought that after having spent years talking about this, why would you then just go and dig them out? Like, what is the point of this dialogue? As I argue in my paper that I wrote about this, this is really a point where I see the city missing a huge opportunity to break the historical circle, choosing to again kind of redo the actions of the past rather than creating a new situation. And I do believe that the finding of these old stones creates a completely new situation, one that calls for a total redevelopment. A central feature really of counter monuments is their engagement in this process of memory. And if there's anything that they stand for, it's memory's material manifestation in public. And so this is why I talk about both the imperative and the opportunity that I see happen, like being present in Germany today, because I think that there's an imperative to confront the real situation, the fact of finding these kinds of stones, but there's also a real opportunity to create a revitalized public space that is being used by all. So that takes me to the present day. If you could go to the next slide, Jess. As we can see here, the fountain is in the back right, and there's some tents set up. They've planted some more trees. And so Platz der Alten Synagoge, or the Square of the Old Synagogue, as it is now called, is extremely well integrated into the heart of the city. It's unavoidable when you arrive by train or by bus, and the redesign has become a part of everyday life for many locals. There's Fridays for Future protests there. Unfortunately, there's also alt-right protests there. Restaurants have pop-ups. So kind of everyday life occurs here. Unfortunately, a mere day after the square was opened on August 2017, what started happening was that kids would start swimming in the fountain. And this was, of course, again, a problem for many who kind of saw this as a memorial space. And this is kind of a process. This is a problem that is still ongoing. The city has decided to put up pictograms to encourage people to behave respectfully in the same way that they have them at the large memorial in Berlin, where there's also kind of advising to people to not run, to shout, or to play games. Unfortunately, this hasn't worked, and they've now put up temporary signs. So this project in total has cost millions of euros, and I think that it is, if only financially, a positive thing to see a city such as so small, like as small as Freiburg, putting so much money into remembering a community that numbered in the hundreds. Of course, there's an argument to be made that more could have been done earlier, but I think that it's a really positive thing that the space that used to be occupied by a Jewish synagogue is now the most lively in all of Freiburg. In total, the construction, as I said, cost millions, and it's an ongoing thing. There's talks about a Dokumentationszentrum, so a documentary or a documentation center that is going to collect all of the artifacts of Jewish life in Freiburg and the oppression that was wrought upon them under National Socialism. And I think that it's interesting that as the temporal distance to these crimes actually increases, and the opportunity to rely on survivor communication or survivor testimony decrease, like those opportunities decrease, the city of Freiburg has actually taken it upon itself to create more and more opportunities to engage with this past. So while this is, of course, only one way or one instance in which a German city has gone about things, I think it shows the importance of making historical considerations early in redevelopment projects and the real vitality that art or public art can bring to these discussions. I'm really optimistic about the future of these kinds of projects, and I'm hopeful to be part of them one day. Thank you very much.